Now that we're winding down on our lectures, we're going to start to zero in on the upper portion of the body. We've talked about torso, arms, hands, pelvis, legs, and feet. And now we're going to move up toward our head area. So this week, we're talking about the neck and skull. And on top of the skull, the muscles that make up the skull. So it's fairly comprehensive, but there's not a huge amount of information, and it should all, for the most part, make sense. Next week, for our very last lecture, we'll be discussing the individual features on the face. But this week, our focus is on the underlying construction of the head, the skull, and then the muscles on top of it. So we are going to also discuss sort of some of the proportions of the skull and some basic things to think about while seeking out the skull in a portrait. And this is a very common thing to do. Norman Rockwell writes in his book that when he studied under Bridgman had to drawing hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of skulls. So they would even take a sheet of paper or a photo and then of somebody and draw the skull over the photo so that they could seek out the skull in there. And if you had a good skull and you had a good structure, then you could build a face on top of it. But if you don't have a good structure, foundation, then when you add those features, your face will tend to look quite flat. So we're going to look for basic proportions of the skull, as well as bony landmarks that might aid us in drawing it. But before we move up to the skull, let's first take a look at the neck. Now we have one bone listed in your textbook that we have to think about concerning the neck, and that's the seventh cervical vertebra. The seventh cervical vertebra, of course, is on the spine. In fact, it's the seventh little spinal vertebra down there. And the reason we mention it is because it's often very visible, and you can actually feel it when you just reach back behind and feel the back of your neck. You'll feel that bony projection back there. The rest of the spinal column does not have much of a visible appearance until you get down to possibly the sacrum, and we'll see that. We talked about the sacrum a few weeks ago. But the only one on the neck we're going to mention is the seventh cervical vertebra, and that sort of indicates our launching point for the neck there. A nice bony landmark to measure off of. Now, as far as the muscles are concerned with the neck, keep in mind that the vertebrae the spinal column is pretty small. We do have a lot of muscles creating a neck. It's not just a column shooting out of the torso. It's a common mistake that students can make. We have some taper there. We have a lead-in toward the head. And we've already talked about the main muscle responsible for that big, broad shape of the neck, and that's the trapezius. The trapezius is actually on the back side here, but it does come up to create this sort of sloping up to the back of the neck here. So we will see some form here on the neck. It's not just that column sticking out. Now that the trapezius is on the back side, however, we do see it from the front side. We'll see, the big, nice honking muscle right here that feels really good when we get a neck massage. That's our trapezius. We can see it on the front, coming above our clavicle here. And on the front of the neck, we have a very pronounced muscle that gives the neck quite a bit of shape and actually helps us to form the pit of our neck. We talked already about the sternum and the clavicle coming together to form the pit here, but ascending from there up toward the skull, we also have another broad muscle, and it's on either side, running up, and it's got two attachment points down here. It's got a sternum attachment point, and it's got a clavicle attachment point, and then it runs up behind the ear back up here. Now it's had some common names, such as the bonnet string muscle, because it tends to look like a bonnet string coming down if it's really, really flexed. And the name we're going to use for it, even the name that Bridgman does list, is the sternocleidomastoid. And that makes sense. Masticate is to chew, so mastoid is going up to the jaw. Sterno and cleido are indicative that it starts or attaches at its lower point to the sternum and the clavicle. So it's a sternocleidomastoid. The name describes the three attachment points. So that muscle we'll see. We'll start at the sternum and at the clavicle, and then it'll run up, sort of back behind the ear is where it'll appear to go. It gives a nice rigid shape to the front of the neck. And you can actually feel it. When you flex your neck, you can really feel that sternocleidomastoid there. Now there is also another little bit that adds some form here. And that's it's not a bone and it's not a muscle, but it's a piece of cartilage. And that cartilage is the larynx. And the common name for the larynx is the Adam's apple. But women have a larynx as well. It's just not as pronounced. And so if we imagine, the front of our skeleton, here is our clavicle, and then our sternum here. So we have our sternocleidomastoid here. And this is what's creating all the shape in our neck here. And then in the center of the sternocleidomastoid here is our larynx. And that larynx, of course, is responsible for us creating sound and speaking. And it will have some shape to it. Bridgman does a pretty good job describing the shape of the larynx. It's more pronounced in some people, less pronounced in others. So just look out for that. But keep in mind that, let's add our trapezius here. So when we look at a neck like this, we're going to see, thinking about the topographical lines here, we're going to see that bulk of the trapezius, and then a ridge here of the sternocleidomastoid, and then sort of a divot going to the next ridge of the sternocleidomastoid, and then it swoops down, but when it hits the larynx, it comes up and over. So we've got quite a bit of shape in there. You need to think about all these forms that are happening within the neck. The neck is not just a simple cylindrical column. It's got a lot of subtle forms and divots and wrapping that we have to concern ourselves with. Again, trapezius, sternocleidomastoid, and then the larynx there. From there we can move straight up to the skull. Now there's a few things to consider with the construction of a skull. Some people just start with a sphere or an oval and build on top of it, marking the eyes as the midline, and then building from there. Other artists will seek out what's called the mask, and the mask represents the two eyes and the nose. And if you can get those positioned correctly, you can use those to triangulate everything. So, for example, if you have two eyes in a skull, so I'm just going to draw a couple eye sockets here, so something like this. If you have those and you place them correctly and they're the correct size based off of observation, then we could utilize the corners of this as well as an angle to figure out, for example, where the bottom of the nasal cavity might be, which is something like here. And the bottom of the nasal cavity will be very close to the wings of the nostrils. That's where a lot of artists will find the corners of the mouth. From there, you could also use triangulation to figure out the corners of the mouth, for example. So you could angle a corner from the eye socket, a corner from the nasal cavity to find one side of the mouth, and then let's do this. And then repeat that action for the other side. This gives you corners of the mouth, and then from there you can build on top of that and create a portrait. So that's a common way for observational painting. That's, I do that quite frequently. I keep the knowledge of the proportions of the skull in the back of my head, and then I start by getting something right, in this case the eyes, and then from those eyes I start to build up the rest of the drawing in good proportion to each other, and I always check the marks I'm making against my knowledge of the skull. So what is described in the Academy textbook is sort of a very, very basic method of how you can construct or think about the skull, which is intended really only to tell you where things should line up, where the mouth should sit under the eye socket, where Nasal cavity should sit under the eyes, etc., etc. So that you have a general idea of the plumbs and levels of the face. However, it's not going to bear any real practical world application. And the odds of you drawing a portrait from straight on is very, very unlikely. Usually there's got to be some sort of tilt or angle or something associated with the portrait to make it interesting. Otherwise it just looks like a basic mug shot, which we wouldn't want to be painting. So the step-by-step that's included in the book, it's good to familiarize yourself with it only in so much that you can, from your imagination, know the alignments of the certain features of the skull. Beyond that, there's not a huge amount of usefulness to it, but we can incorporate the knowledge into our drawing of the skull. We should, however, before we get into the proportions, mention some basic bones associated with the skull, so we know what we're trying to draw and what we're leading to. First and foremost, I think listed in your textbook is the frontal bone. Represents the bone on the forehead here, frontal bone. We have underneath that the nasal bone right here. And then we have what's called the zygomatic or zygomatic arch, sometimes called the malar, depending on which textbook you're reading in. We'll just call it the zygomatic arch here. It's this bone here. It runs from the nasal bone, swings back up to touch the top of the bottom of the frontal bone there. And then it also, as you can see, flows back and ends right around where the opening of your ear is. So you can feel it, your cheekbone here. Your cheekbone is your zygomatic arch. It's usually a visible landmark that we can utilize. And the important thing to understand here, and sometimes we can get backwards in this understanding, this is what causes drawings to look strange or come out weird, is when we draw an eye socket, we're really drawing empty space. When you draw an eye socket, you are actually drawing the bottom of the frontal bone, the side of the nasal bone, and the top of the zygomatic arch. So we have to consider the bones associated with that and how the eye socket is only there because of an indentation in those bones. So, for example, there will be students who draw a skull from a 3/4 view and then not really know how to handle the eye socket here because it's empty space. So they end up completely omitting a portion of the zygomatic arch back there and cutting into the skull a bit. So we always have to seek out the bone forms that's creating those sockets. So we have the eye socket is the easy one. Then we have the nasal socket here. And the nasal socket is created again, nasal bone on top, zygomatic arch here on the sides. And then we have the superior maxillary right here, which is the upper portion of your mouth. It's also called maxilla is another common name for it. So a superior maxillary or maxilla. Why is it called superior maxillary? Well, a name for the jawbone here is the inferior maxillary. So superior meaning above, inferior meaning below. Maxillary referring to the mouth. The jaw though does have another common name called a mandible. So we can call this here the mandible or the inferior maxillary. And the top one we can call the maxilla or the superior maxillary. Any of those names will be acceptable. So again, the nasal bone is the nasal socket is created by the nasal bone on the top, the zygomatic arch on the side, and the maxilla below. Other than that, I think that's pretty good for our bones of the skull. So we can talk about some of the alignments and the construction of the skull. One thing that you're going to need to sort of just figure out or memorize to use it as a launching point is a few of the shapes. One of those shapes is going to be the overall shape of the eye socket. Another shape is going to be later on the shape of the nose, and then the sort of shape of the jawbone. If you can figure out those shapes, we can start to construct a lot of this proportional alignments from that. So for example, when seen from the front, we would start with an eye socket. Now, an eye socket proportionally is roughly square. So it's about as wide as it is tall. So I could even start with a square here. which I'll carve out in just a moment. As far as the shape goes, let's say this is going to be our right eye here. So your left, our right. Now the shape of the eye is going to have a sort of subtle curve on the back, and then it's going to arch with a little concave nature where the nasal bone is going to be, and then it's going to level out down here, and then this is about the third way mark, then about the third way mark here it's going to start to swing back up. So that's sort of our basic shape of the eye socket. A gentle sloping curve along the top, it flattens out and becomes plumb on the right side, and there's a concavity about a third of the way down here, or a third of the way up here. So if we divide this box into threes. On this bottom third, we have the concave arch, and then it levels off about a third in, and then another third, it starts to swing back up. That's our basic eye socket shape. Obviously, there's deviations from that, but if we have an understanding of that's kind of what an eye socket looks like, it's a good launching point to start from there. And if, at very least, you should keep in mind that the eye socket is roughly square, and we can go from there. Now, when we're looking at a person, you may or may not be able to see the full eye socket. Sometimes the eyes are very, very deep set, and it's really easy to see the eye socket. Sometimes they're not. Sometimes we've got a lot of eyebrow hair concealing where the top of the eye socket is. Sometimes we have no eyebrow hair, and it just looks completely smooth. Sometimes the cheekbones are very pronounced, making the bottom of the eye socket easy to see. Sometimes the cheekbones are not very pronounced, and it looks almost flat going from the zygomatic arch into the eye. So we do have to seek it out. What we can relatively safely say is that, and we'll talk about this a little bit next week, is that towards the back end of the eyebrow here, the eyebrow arches up and over the eye socket top here. So our eye socket should be fairly visible here on the upper lateral side. So that'll mark the top of our eye socket. And usually, depending on how the lighting is, we can see some sort of shadow there. The bottom of the eye socket can get a little trickier. And you can feel it on you. You can start to feel where the bottom of the eye socket is, the top of that zygomatic arch, right there. But usually it's where the bottom of the pouch of the eye, the crease of the eyeball lid down here, is going to represent the bottom of that eye socket. Now, depending on how the light is on the model, our eyebrows could cast shadows partial way down the cheek here, or it might cast a shadow towards just the eye here, which gives the illusion that all of this is in light. It gives the illusion of a very short eye socket. In that case, you have to be very, very careful to indicate the subtle value shifts in anatomy in the cheek to make sure that it doesn't appear just flat and a tiny little eye socket. You don't want little sliver eye sockets. We need to make sure there's enough room for a full-on eye socket, especially if we're going to be using that as a check to measure the rest of our drawing against. So that's our basic eye. From this one eye, we can figure out the whole proportions, the whole dimensions of our skull. The eye is centered, or the eye socket is centered about right at the halfway mark from the head, from the top of the skull to the bottom of the skull. So it is a good place to start in that regard. And when we count how many eye sockets tall and how many eye sockets below we need to go to create the head, it comes out to just under 2. So it's roughly something like 1 6/7 eye sockets on each side. So if we take a measurement here, go 1, 2, that's going to mark the top, and then we'll just double check that we got that correct. 1, 2, that's pretty good. And then it's also too low. 1, 2. Now, when we start to draw that, we envision, this being a box that our skull is going to be in. Our natural tendency is to say, wow, that eye socket is way too low. There's too little room here and too much room there. And that's common. Most people who don't have any experience drawing portraiture, when asked to draw a face, do position the head, or the eyes, much higher on the head, because we don't account for all this hair here. There is a sizable portion of skull from the forehead where the hair meets up to the top of the head, and you don't want to cut that off. So we should have an equal amount of spacing below the eye and above the eye, a little lower here. Now as far as the width goes, well, we can use this to place the other eye socket. The other eye socket is obviously one eye socket wide. Where is it placed? Well, it's about half of an eye socket over. So if we take this eye socket, we need to figure out what half of that eye socket is. So 1, 2, somewhere around there. And this allows us to place the other eye socket. Another marker running out. Switch to a green one here. We'll finish our skull in green. There we go. Now, again, the size of the eye socket should be the same, just one eye socket, and it should be roughly square. Students who miss the idea that the eye socket is square end up with very skewed skulls, either far too tall or far too wide. They tend to look a little alien or non-human. So we'll repeat the shape of the eye socket over here, gentle sloping on the top, about a third of the way up on the bottom. We have this concave arch, and then it levels off at about 1/3, and then levels back up on the outside there. So we're starting to get some eyes in here, eyes of our skull. Now the outside of the skull, the widest point of the skull is actually up here in the temporal location. So it's going to be somewhere up here. And that is going to be about half of an eye socket out from the outside of the eye socket. So we take the eye socket there, half of an eye socket out. Same thing on this side, half of an eye socket out. And that gives us our width. So here's our overall box for a human head. We can build on top of and build on top of. Keep in mind measurements for a human skull about 8 inches tall. So that's going to be our starting base, somewhere around 8 inches, and then we'll build muscle and hair and etc. on top of that. We've got our eye sockets. We can start to move down, develop a nasal cavity. So, how tall is the nasal cavity? Well, when we look at the skull from straight on, we'll see that it's about, but perhaps a little less, but around 1 eye socket tall. And it's positioned at this, around this 1/3 mark here, is where the starting point is. So it's about 1 eye socket down, positioned about 1/3 of the way up the eye. So again, if we take our measurement of 1 eye socket, position it about 1/3 of the way down, or 1/3 of the way from the bottom of the eye socket, you can mark the bottom there. The shape of the nasal cavity should be sort of triangular shape. You can see on here, with a triangle wedge shape. And it will line up with around, at the bottom, around the inside corner of the eyes. Perhaps a little wider, give or take. So we're going to see something like this. That's our nasal cavity boundaries, left, right, bottom, top. And then we'll create our sort of triangle shape. It does have 2 sort of rounded curves at the bottom here. So we can indicate that there. Getting close, it's starting to look like a jack-o'-lantern at this point. So we'll ideally take it from the jack-o'-lantern to a finished drawing. This, though, I will say, becomes a very critical measurement. For a portrait painting, this, what we call the mask, represents your anchors for how we're going to measure everything else. So you do need to spend a good amount of time getting that figured out correctly. When I'm doing a 3-hour portrait, I'll spend upwards of the first 2 hours sometimes even a little more, figuring this out. Ears can be indicated quite easily and placed usually by taking levels to this. The mouth can be a little tricky, but if we use this successfully to figure out where to place it, it can be done quickly, and then hair can be suggested rather quickly. But this becomes critically important, and especially when you think about where we look on people when you first see somebody, especially for facial recognition, we typically first look at the eyes and nose, then we would look at the mouth, and then we would look at the ancillary areas. So you want to consider proportionally the level of refinement and accuracy has to be very, very high in the areas that we're first going to look at in the portrait in this mask. So from there we can start to develop the zygomatic arch, we'll call it, here, and then figure out the superior maxillary. Now the zygomatic arch, again, it's wrapping around the ear, so we can see, wrapping around the eye socket, so we can see it swinging right at that eye socket there. And it's going to come forward. It's sort of a square flat shape, and it's not just directly forward, it is angled back a little. And you'll notice also that it starts, the bottom of the zygomatic arch is around the bottom of the nasal bone too. So we're going to see something like that there. The frontal bone we usually indicate with a little bit of roundness right up in here. And temporal bone up there. Now what about the superior maxillary in here, or the maxilla? Well, the left and right outer boundaries of that are going to align with about the inner third of the eye socket here. So if you were to take a plumb line down, straight down from that inner third, we should be somewhere right around here. And that zygomatic arch is going to feed nicely right into that superior maxillary. So we're going to see something like this. Now, before we go too much further, it's important to set a reference point for where the mouth is. One of the most common things, I would say, in the face, above all else, is by the time we get down to the mouth, something askew has happened with our measurements. Either we didn't give our head enough room, or maybe our eyes grew or shrank too much within the confines of our head. And the mouth ends up getting compressed and shrunken down to the bottom section. So the mouth is set too low, and it looks like we're missing some jawbone. So we need to figure out where that is accurately placed and always check everything to make sure we're good. I can't tell you how many times I've had students get all the way down here and finish all the way down to the chin, and then it looks strange and compressed, and then they have to work their way back and find it was a simple measurement with the eye, that within the context of this overall head box, they made the eye that big instead of this large, or they made it a little too big, like that big, and as a result it just pushed the mouth further and further and further down. But your mouth has to be positioned correctly within the context of the head. Now when we look at the mask, and we use the mask as our launching point to determine where the head's going to be, we can start to consider a good placement. So in our skull here, the meeting of the teeth here is going to fall at just above the halfway point between the bottom of the nasal cavity and the bottom of the chin. So determine where that halfway point is. So in one, maybe right, I'm going to guess that it's about right there. Then I'll check. Well, that's a little bit above. So the halfway point is here. If you set a mouth that low, it's going to look very, very strange. So we need to go a little bit above that. A little bit above that represents the meeting of the teeth. That still ends up looking too low for a mouth, actually. And what we'll find next week when we talk about the features of the face and the mouth, we'll see that the lips, where they meet, is a little bit above the meeting point of the teeth. So if you can feel past your lips, you'll feel that you're hitting midway between your top teeth. So the lips actually meet somewhere up here. So if we're actually drawing a portrait the mouth would be way up here in a portrait, not way down here. But for a skull, we'll consider that it's a little bit above the halfway point between the nasal bone and, or I'm sorry, nasal cavity and the chin here. So we're going to have some teeth. The actual teeth set in somewhere around a third-ish of the way up. A third to, it wouldn't quite be a half, but something around there. And they're going to arch back. We have to consider that this is a cylinder. The teeth are wrapping back around. Now we can draw the bottom mandible, or inferior maxillary as well. The meeting point is going to be the back where the zygomatic arch feeds back into the ear back there. And it's going to arch down. And you'll see as it arches down, the back of the jaw lines up with about the outside here of the eye socket. So we're going to arch down. And the back of the jaw is going to be about plumb back here. And from there, it's going to arch inward so that the bottom of the jaw, here at the widest point, is going to be set just on the outside, or at the 1/3 point in. So if this is the 1/3 point in, our jaw is going to come into there. And we'll do the same on the other side. Start back here, zygomatic arch, to the inside of the eye socket, into the 1/3 point. And from there, it's going to start to angle inward. And then the inside of the jaw here, or yeah, the jaw, the mandible, is going to swing from the plumb level of the outside of the eye down to the third here, and then meet up to the inner third with the superior maxillary. So we have to consider that there is some space there. And we get our teeth. Oops. Here we go. The teeth are going to be about the same on the top and bottom as far as the size. Keep in mind it does level off a little bit at the bottom, but some people may have more of a cleft chin. And we can angle off some of these angles, trim off some of these angles to make a little more curvature to the bottom of our jaw there. And keep that level. So again, just to recap, the jaw is going to start back where the zygomatic arch feeds into the ear. It's going to swing down to the outer portion of the eye socket. From there, swing into the outer, the first third, and then make its archway slowly down towards the point. On the top side of that jaw, it's going to start kind of at the outside of the eye socket, then swing down to the outer third, and then meet the teeth at that inner third there. That's giving us the bottom of our jaw. So some people have a very square jaw, some people have a more pointed jaw. We might see someone with a jaw more like this, a little more square pointed. Or I'm sorry, a little more pointed. You might see somebody with a very pronounced, strong jaw. But where the arches, the angles, starts to change, is going to be relatively the same in everyone, regardless of how pronounced or angled their jaw is. So keep up an eye for these angles. So we can make it look like a human jaw. The top of the head skull should be pretty simple, straightforward. It's going to start obviously back where this zygomatic arch feeds back, and it's going to angle upwards and out towards the widest point, which again is up at the temporal location here. And then it's going to just angle back. I encourage you to take these with angles primarily, and then start to chop those angles down so that you don't get too curved right away. You don't want that skull to bulge out too much. It's relatively smooth angle going across, and it shouldn't appear to be bulging toward the top. There we go. And that's your basic construction for a skull. Again, that's intended to really give you the placement, vertical placement and some of the horizontal placements on the face. We look at the eye socket so we can figure out the eye sockets have about half of an eye socket with space between them and about half of an eye socket on the outside to the outer edges of the head. We know that the nose should be, from the nasal bone here down to about the nostrils here, should be about one eye socket tall, and it should be placed starting at the lower third of the eye. We know that the meeting of the teeth is a little bit above the halfway mark between the nasal cavity and the jaw. As far as the jaw alignments, I think the shape will vary a little bit, but we'll take the bottom of this jaw from the outer zygomatic to the outer portion of the eye socket. From there, swoop it into the third portions of the eye as we swing towards the front. That gives us a good basic placement. Now, if we were to put a hair on top of this, we would see something like what we normally expect to see in a person. An eye placement that looks like it's substantially higher than it actually is. The eye sockets are dead in the middle of the face when the face is looking straight on at you. So we are going to add some muscles on this in a couple minutes, but before we do, let's go to a side construction of the head. Now, the side construction of the head, we can begin by thinking about some of the measurements that we took for the front construction of the head, because there's a lot of similarities. For example, we are going to use the eye socket placement and the nose socket placement to figure out where we're lining everything up to. And then we're also going to consider how to utilize those to get the full depth of backside of the skull. So, for example, if we start with, again, an eye socket, we should consider that it's going to be not square in this case, but actually about a ratio of 2 to 3 here. If we look at it from the side, if we were going to take the inside here as the frontmost portion of the eye socket, and then the back side here, it does depend on how the skull is, or the skeleton is angled. In this case, from my point of view, it's about 1 to 2 here, and here it's about 2 to 3, and this is going to be a more profile view for me. So it's going to be about 2 back to 3 tall, so I need to figure about how big to make this. So it's about there. Another thing I want to consider is the tilt of the head. Now, if you have the jaw flat against the plane of the floor, that's actually representing the head that's looking up. If your jaw is flat here, then the person is looking up. If a person is looking straight forward, the jaw is going to be angled, and we have to consider the shape of the eye socket when the jaw is angled, and then, if needed, tilt it up. But the basic shape of the eye socket when it's angled is that it's going to have an arch towards the back, it's going to slope up in the front where there's the angularity of the nasal bone, and then it's going to swoop back to create the curvature here of the inside. So we're something like this. And again, this will change from person to person, and also change depending on where you look at it. Now, when we're drawing it from the model, it's usually fairly easy to identify this backside of this eye socket shape. Much more tricky to identify the inside shape of it because it is kind of ambiguous. I mean, you look even on here, and there's no real clear definition. And this here kind of represents the termination of the actual bones here, nasal bone, and then going up into the frontal bone here. But when we look at the model, there's going to be light and shadow on there, and that light and shadow pattern is going to create the inside of the socket. But there is this bony ridge here of the nasal bone. And so we're kind of calling this little bony pronunciation the front of the eye socket here. Where that little bony ridge is, and where it terminates is where the eye socket technically is going to begin here. So here's our eye socket shape. From there, we can figure out the nose placement, which, again, remember, it's the nasal cavity is going to start 1/3 of the way up from the bottom there. And then from that location, we can take one eye socket and head straight down. And that's our bottom of our nasal cavity. Now, the nasal cavity, important to consider, it's projected more on the top, in the nasal bone, than on the bottom. So the bottom is set back a little bit. But we have this little beak right here that the septum connects to here. And that little beak does push forward a little bit. So we are going to see some shape. Yeah, it's a pretty interesting shape here. So we got the nasal bone here. And then it swoops back and kind of swoops up. And that's our nasal cavity there. Just make sure that that nasal cavity does not get bigger than your eye socket. Now, the pronunciation of the nasal bone is dependent on the individual person. Could be a lot, could be a little. Okay, from there, we're going to drop down. We can figure out the placement of the mouth as well. The mouth is actually going to protrude a little bit if the chin is parallel to the floor. Straight down, however, it's going to be the nasal bone that's in front. So if we look, this would be a straight-on view. So we can see that nasal bone should protrude a little bit in the front, and then the teeth are going to be set back a little bit more. So we have to consider nasal bone, or nasal socket here coming back, maybe even a little bit more. Teeth coming out, but not protruding as far as the nasal bone in front. The vertical placement, again, we're going to take, for the bottom and top of the skull, 2 eye sockets, a little less than 2 eye sockets. So we go 1, 2, it's going to yield the bottom. 1, 2, going to yield the top. And then we want to look for the halfway point between the nasal cavity and the chin to determine where our teeth are going to meet. So let's see, 1, 2. So this is about the halfway point, so I want them to meet a little bit above, something like there. So we're going to arch forward. Now actually the maxilla is going to arch forward, slope forward, and then the teeth are going to go a little straight down. So we're going to see an angle, and then it drops to be a little more plumb, but a little bit oblique. And then same is going to be true for the teeth on bottom. The teeth on bottom usually point forward. You can see a little bit more, and then it's going to fade back into the mandible, and then the chin there of the front starts to poke forward a little bit more. Next week we'll talk about the specific stair-step sort of action that profile takes. From here, we're getting kind of far along here. We can figure out the cheekbone, the back of the jaw, where that's going to be placed. And it's actually sort of a square shape. If we take the top of the eye, or I'm sorry, the top of the zygomatic arch, the bottom of the eye socket, this right here, down to the jaw, right there. This distance, if we make a square out of it, going from the front of the nasal cavity, so this distance here, or front of the mouth, roughly around here, and we get a square measurement from this distance, and then make a square straight back. This represents where the back of your jaw would be, and also represents where that zygomatic arch is feeding into the ear. So we can create the zygomatic arch now, something like this. And there we go, something like there. And that zygomatic arch is feeding back. And then we can also create the jaw, the lower jaw, the mandible from there. So it's sort of flat on the bottom, and then it begins to angle back. It's kind of got this whale shape. You can kind of imagine the back of the mandible being a tail, and the front being the whale. So we got kind of this whale shape here like this. And then some teeth, of course, sticking out of it. So that becomes our bottom of the jaw. Make sure when you draw this that you make this shape broad enough here. That's a common error that students have, is this doesn't become broad enough and we have like this weak little jaw there. We are chewers, we need to chew a lot of plant material here, so we need a nice strong jaw. And you look at the apes that have to chew even more nuts and hard fibrous things all day long. They have really well-developed jaws there for chewing. So our jaws are going to be smaller than them because we have cooked food now. We don't have to chew as hard, but we still have a good amount of shape in there that we need to indicate. So this is giving us most of the skull. Last little bit we have to concern ourselves with is the back of the head. Now, it's going to, if we take a plumb here, somewhere around the bottom of the nasal cavity is where the bottom of this cranial bulge is going to be, and then it's just going to wrap right on back and then arch at the top. So sort of an oblique angle. Keep in mind the forehead is not front flat like that. The forehead is oblique. Especially if we're seeing seeing somebody who is looking straight forward. How far back do we need to go? Well, there's the easiest thing to do is to just replicate this square measurement to go back. That tells us the back boundary. Why does that work? Well, when we considered the size of the skull, we said something like it was 8 inches tall and 7.5 or so inches back. Well, if we're taking the distance from the bottom of the eye socket down to the jaw, we're getting a distance that's about 2/5 of the 2/5 of the total height of the skull, and then we're doubling it twice from the nasal cavity back. And actually, I think we should have gone back here. There we go. So if we go from this 2/5 plus this 2/5 gives us a 4/5, which is pretty darn close to the 7.5 or so inches back. So we'll be pretty close to within reasonable size to create a relatively believable skull. The rest of the bulk is going to be added on by hair, by muscles, etc., etc. But this should give us a basic foundation. What we need to be really aware of is that if we were to take a measurement from top to back here, it is nearly square. Obviously, not quite square. It's got to be a little bit taller than it is deep back. But aside from the mouth, the next common mistake we would see in students with profiles is that they cut the back of the head off too soon. They don't take a height measurement and then compare it to the depth of the head to give us that full cranial bulk. So we need to make sure that not only is it tall enough, on the order of 8 inches tall, but also deep enough. And mouth is getting a little low there, huh? There we go. It's better. So again, 8 inches tall, 7.5 inches deep. It should appear to be a little taller than it is deep. If we're clear on kind of the basic measurements, again, the eye socket, mouth, everything stays the same. We're just looking at the distance from the front of the skull to the jaw, and then from the jaw to the back of the head. Those are important distances. If we're good on that, then we can go ahead and move on to adding muscles to the skull. The muscles of the face that we're going to talk about are not a whole lot. In fact, I think you may end up drawing a few more in the Bridgman book. But we're going to cover some of the basic ones that are responsible for some of the broader strokes of action in the human face, and then ideally it'll be up to you and your sensitive perception to fill in the rest, or study facial recognition more and more. Most artists don't go too much past the basic muscles that we're going to see here today, because we just want to be aware of the muscles. They're not huge landmarks, but if you're going to get into very expressive portraiture or very big amounts of action, illustration, things like that, then you may want to become aware of some of the more subtle muscles associated with the face. But we're just going to talk about some of the broad main muscles that help to add a little bit of bulk to the skull that we see here. Well, if we move over to our front skull, we'll do the majority of our muscle additions here. And we'll start with what's called the occipitofrontalis, or the frontalis. This is one that you will draw in Bridgman. It's a big, large muscle group that's right on the frontal bone here. And wouldn't you know, that's the main group responsible for all of our raising of eyebrows and a lot of the expression in the forehead, in the front of the face there. So it's a big one, and it can cause a lot of interesting shapes we want to be aware of, a lot of wrinkles that we can have to describe some certain motions. Aside from that, moving down, we have something called a corrugator of the eyebrow. Corrugator of the eyebrows are right in here, and it's intended for helping us push our eyebrows down, make a broader range of facial expression when used in conjunction with the occipitofrontalis. Corrugator means it's corrugating, it's squishing it. Eyebrow, it's right at the eyebrow there. So that should be pretty straightforward. When we get down to the cheek, we have two main muscles that Bridgman refers to and that you'll see pop up in terminology: the greater zygomatic and the lesser zygomatic. So we're going to see the greater here on the outside, the lesser on the inside, helping for some expressive motions in the face. Lesser on the inside, greater on the outside. Now, a muscle that tends to add a lot of bulk, or mass, if you will, and it's also involved in mastication and chewing, a big, nice, well-developed, strong muscle. It's called the masseter, and that's bridging the gap between the superior maxillary, or the maxilla, and the mandible here, coming along the outside. It's a nice, strong muscle to give us some chomping action. Some people, it is very well developed, and it adds this little curvature that is offset by the angularity of the jaw. So it's a good idea to look out for. When you chomp your jaw together, you can feel the bulge here. It's tenser right on the outside here. A muscle of expression and talking that we'll use. One last one to talk about here is it's called the buccinator. It's running forward here, attaching to the mouth here, responsible for giving us a greater range of expression, moving our mouth back, and helping us talk, helping us chew or form words. We do have some muscles around the mouth, some muscles around the eye in circular motions that help us to do a little more action. They don't add a whole lot of bulk, and we're not going to talk about them too much, but we will talk about one more here, the temporal. It adds a little bit of bulk right out here on the outside of that temporal side of the skull. If we apply these same muscles to the side profile of the skull, we can see the temporal here, the occipitofrontalis in front here, our corrugator, the eyebrow would be on the inside, and then the masseter, I'm sorry, giving us a big nice bulk there, buccinator running along horizontally there. And then we have the greater zygomatic and the lesser zygomatic. That's all of the muscles we're going to talk about with the face. Those are the main muscles. Beyond that, we're going to study features. So next week's lecture, we're going to actually zero in, not talk anymore about the muscles of the face, but talk about some of the subtle perceptions we need to look out for with the eye, with the nose, the mouth, and the ear. And then, like I said, if you're going to be moving into character animation or illustration or very, very expressive portraits, you may want to pick up some of the anatomy books. There's also several good books on facial expression for the artists that you can pick up and start to get a little more particular about it. But start with some of the main broad muscles when you do your studies, these muscles here, and some of the Vanderpool drawings and Bridgman drawings, and then move on to the more subtle muscles, because these muscles are going to be responsible for the major actions, and they're also going to be responsible for a lot of the bulk that we're going to see in facial, on the head in portraits.